Hi there, I'm David Busch and we are back at Buschistory.net. This presentation is a continuation of 11.1, which was an explanation, if you want, of the 1850s. This is going to be a list of important people and terms, and something I call a logic web, which I'll actually walk through with you. But let's take a look at the important people in terms of the 1850s. There may be more. This is a list I put together, and you might want to add even more to it. So let's take a look. Certainly, we have the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 and the Personal Liberty Laws, and they are connected. The Fugitive Slave Law, as stated previously, says that if a slave runs away, he must be returned. He must be returned regardless of where he is in the United States, and the people in the northern towns and cities are supposed to assist in the returning of those slaves. Now, you know that's not going to go well in Massachusetts. It's not going to go well in New York. It's not going to go well in Maine. What those states do is they start enacting personal liberty laws. Personal liberty laws are just what they sound like. Personal liberty laws make it a crime to turn over a runaway slave into federal jurisdiction or federal control, if you like. So now we have the states battling the federal government the very same way the South battled the federal government over the issue of the tariffs and over the idea of whether there should be slavery or not in each of the new states. Uncle Tom's Cabin, the most printed, most widely read book of the 19th century, and is Harriet Beecher Stowe's very poignant look at what happens to families as a result of slavery. The two principal characters, Uncle Tom and Eliza, they have very, very different fates in this book, and it's well worth watching. My all-time favorite book. But the key about Uncle Tom's Cabin was it didn't start out life as a book. It was serialized. It was 1 week at a time with one chapter at a time. That allowed the book to stay in the public consciousness for the better part of a year. I believe there's 45, maybe 46 chapters to it. It's something like that. And each week ended with somewhat of a cliffhanger. And people would debate it and they say, oh, that can't be true. That's definitely true. I've seen that. And it went back and forth. Whether it was genius or luck or a combination of both, it really did illustrate the problems of slavery and set the nation on fire. When Abraham Lincoln introduces Harriet Beecher Stowe, he introduces her as the woman who wrote the book who started the Great War. Can't overestimate the importance of it. Propaganda. Both the North and the South were waging a propaganda war about slavery. You have people like William Lloyd Garrison with his Liberator, with constant stories about the horrors of slavery. The South called Uncle Tom's Cabin propaganda. On the other side of it, a guy by the name of George Fitzhugh wrote a book called Cannibals All, in which he said the North was worse than the South, that the factory owners in the North were eating up their workers until they died. That they would pay them almost nothing, they would use them until they could no longer work, and then just get rid of them, the way we get rid of bodily waste. So, cannibals all. Propaganda was an important tool today in politics and back in the 1850s as well. Popular sovereignty, the idea that a state can choose for itself whether it wants to be free or slave. This idea of choosing for themselves, an interesting idea. But you need 50,000 people. And until you get it, there's going to be battles within those states. It does work in the Compromise of 1850 because you're talking about California, and California was certainly going to vote to be free. And you're talking about the Southwest, which is largely desert, and people weren't moving into the Southwest. So the model for it was a great model. Didn't work so well for Stephen Douglas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Then we get to this Sumner-Brooks affair. The Sumner-Brooks affair, Preston Brooks, Charles Sumner, Andrew Butler. Those are the three characters. Charles Sumner gives a speech called the Crime Against Kansas, in which he calls out Andrew Butler, who is a very strong pro-slave proponent. And he says that Andrew Butler has a harlot, and the harlot is slavery. Meaning, Andrew Butler sleeps with a prostitute and the prostitute is slavery. Well, Preston Brooks was Andrew Butler's nephew. And 2 days after that famous speech, The Crime Against Kansas, Preston Brooks goes and he beats Charles Sumner, who's sitting at his desk in front of witnesses who come to hear all of the noise that's going on in the room. And he's beating him over the head with a cane, jumps on the desk, starts beating him. Wham, wham, wham. That is the Sumner Brooks affair. The bigger part about the Sumner Brooks affair is how the public reacted to it. In the South, Preston Brooks was a hero. In the North, he was a criminal. Charles Sumner did not die. He returned to his duties, but he did have some nerve damage, and one side of his face, there was apparent weakness in the muscles, and he was permanently, I don't want to say disfigured, but he was permanently in some way incapacitated from doing all of the things he could do before. Nativism. Nativism is a cousin of racism, and nativism basically says that the United States belongs to the people who were here first. Of course, the silly point behind nativism is, well, who was here first? The nativists were really talking about the Anglicans, the people of Northern European descent who spoke English and who were Protestant, and they disliked immigrants coming from Europe who would take jobs, who believed in Catholicism, notably the Irish, and those are called the nativists. Portrayed very well in a movie called The Gangs of New York, which is a mixture of fact and fiction about a place in New York City called the Five Points area where there was a great mixing of cultures, and you could actually see this nativism going on. James Buchanan. James Buchanan has the distinction of a couple of interesting debates about him, that James Buchanan was a Southern sympathizer. We see it in the Lecompton Constitution, which he endorses the Lecompton Constitution. We see it in the Dred Scott's decision, where he convinces Roger Taney to hold the decision until after he is President of the United States. And we see it when South Carolina secedes, because James Buchanan does nothing. You got to believe James Buchanan is probably pretty happy to leave the presidency in 1861 when Lincoln becomes president. Dred Scott, that very famous case about if a slave travels into free territory, will he be free or will he be slave once he returns back to that's slave territory? Now, without going through all the details, again, Roger Taney says that Dred Scott is not a citizen of the United States and thereby cannot sue. So he doesn't allow Dred Scott to win, and he rules procedurally that slaves have no rights in court. Just an interesting sidebar to this, and it comes up again and again, is how does Dred Scott get to the Supreme Court anyway? Well, Dred Scott's master, John Sanford, is an abolitionist, and he wants the Supreme Court to make a decision, a precedent decision, that says that all slaves who travel into free states are thereby free. Without going into the whole issue why John Sanford is an abolitionist and owns a slave, you can look that one up on your own. Suffice it to say, Dred Scott, by the way, dies 2 years later. Let's keep going. The Confederacy, simply the name of the Southern states, and they want the kind of government we had under the Arts Confederation, which is a very strong states' rights government, and a very weak central government, which ultimately is going to be one of the reasons they lose the Civil War, because they don't ever really unify enough to fight the war. They do a good job, but this whole idea of a strong executive branch does not exist in the Confederacy. Stephen A. Douglas from Illinois, the grandfather of popular sovereignty, if you like, and he runs against Abraham Lincoln in the election of 1858 in Illinois and wins. He becomes senator from Illinois. He runs against Lincoln in the election of 1860 and loses, and Lincoln becomes president of the United States. And of course, all the Lincoln-Douglas debates are when we actually meet Abraham Lincoln, and we learn that Lincoln is not an abolitionist. He is more of an isolationist on the issue of slavery. He has a very famous speech called the House Divided speech, in which he says, "The house divided shall not stand. We shall not remain half slave and half free. It just can't happen." He believes that slavery should be contained in the South and will eventually die out. He does not want slavery eliminated in the South, so he's not an absolute abolitionist, although he's running as the Republican candidate for the presidency in 1860. Lincoln instead is a unionist. He believes that the Union must be preserved, evidenced in the fact that when the South secedes in 1861, he tries to resupply the fort at Sumter, that in the early years of the Civil War, he does not emancipate the slaves, because if he was an absolute abolitionist, he would have emancipated the slaves. When he ultimately does issue the Emancipation Proclamation, he issues it as a wartime idea, a wartime executive order, in an attempt to get the Southern slaves to overthrow their masters and fight for the Union. It's a military tactic more than it is anything else. I'm going to leave this here and come back in just a second. I want to show you something called a logic web. Behind me are the instructions. I'm going to look carefully at the instructions with you, and then I'm going to illustrate how this web works. So stay with me. Background to the Civil War, USAP, United States History Advanced Placement. You can do it for any United States history course, 1850 to 1860. Create a web indicating the series of events leading to the Civil War. I use chapter 15 in Farragher's as a place to begin. Feel free to use any other source. Be prepared to explain your reasoning. So everything in this web gets explained. Using your web, prepare a timeline of the events between 1850 and 1860 leading to the secession of South Carolina. So everything that's on this web, once you're done with the web, gets put in order. As you're going to see, the web is how you answer multiple choice questions, and you'll see that in a second. And the timeline is how you answer an essay question, because the timeline should be in sequence. Then, on a separate sheet of paper, completely explain the significance of each event or situation on your timeline. That term significance does not mean define everything on the timeline. It means explain why it's important. I do not want to hear, for example, that the Kansas-Nebraska Act caused popular sovereignty. What I want is that the Kansas-Nebraska Act led to bleeding Kansas as a result of popular sovereignty, showing that the nation would actually fight to the death over their rights and over what they perceive as their right to own slaves or to outlaw slavery. That's significance. I'm going to flip the screen again. I'm going to show you what this web looks like. Be right back. So here we are. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put, let's start again. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pick the biggest one. Let's pick the biggest thing that we know about the Civil War, and it's the Civil War. So I'm going to write the word Civil War in the middle, and I'm going to draw a bubble around it. Now, I want the first idea that I can directly connect to the Civil War. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write, let's get this out of here. I'm going to write secession, because secession is a direct cause of the Civil War. Now, I want anything I can connect to either one of these. So, for secession, I'm going to connect Abraham Lincoln, because Abraham Lincoln is certainly a cause of secession. Now, what can I connect to any of these three things? Let's see. With Lincoln, I'm going to connect Stephen Douglas. I'm going to connect Stephen Douglas. Now, from Stephen Douglas, if I choose, or from secession, or from Abraham Lincoln, I'm not going to worry about Stephen Douglas right now. I'm going to connect South Carolina to secession, because they are the first state to secede. And when I hear about South Carolina, the first thing that comes to my mind is states' rights, because that's what they're all about, states' rights. Now, I can keep going like this. I can keep going like this, or I can go another way with the causes of the Civil War. Let's see. Let's see. What else can I connect to any of these bubbles? Just think it through for a second. Well, I know, for example, I can connect Lincoln directly to the Civil War. I can do that so it connects more than one place, because without Lincoln, there's no Civil War. Or another cause of the Civil War, I can do economics. And with economics, I can put resources. Now if I choose, I can write the North control the resources. I can do that. Or I can flip it again. For Lincoln, I could write Republican. So, if what I want to do with Republican, I can write abolition. If I choose to. I can do that one. Now going in this direction a little bit, because we have plenty of room over here, I can connect states' rights to popular sovereignty. And of course, I can connect Stephen Douglas to popular sovereignty. Now, with popular sovereignty, I can go up here to Kansas, Nebraska. And from Kansas, Nebraska, I can go to Bleeding, Kansas. I can keep going on and on and on like this to get what really causes a civil war. And you notice what's not there? I don't have the word slavery up there. Now we know slavery is certainly in the undercurrent as we go to the Civil War, but it's obviously so much more than that. There are economic reasons because of the unequal use of resource and division of resource in the United States. That's certainly there. There are political differences over the idea of abolition. Certainly, no doubt about it. There's the states' rights idea, because the states' rights, we know, is more than just slavery. It also has to do with taxes. Because there's a whole nullification crisis. You can keep going on and on and on like this. And if you can do this, and you can create a huge logic web, it's an incredible study tool. Because what you do with the logic web is you turn around, you look at it and go, okay, Civil War, secession, sure, South Carolina was the first state to secede. It seceded in December of 1860 because of the election of Lincoln, of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was a Republican, and the whole mantra of the Republican Party was abolition. The alternative to Abraham Lincoln was Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was all for popular sovereignty. We see that popular sovereignty in Kansas, Nebraska, but it didn't work out too well because we have Bleeding Kansas. And Bleeding Kansas is really a microcosm of what will become the Civil War. You can keep going like that and make it bigger and bigger. And then what you do is you take and you make a timeline out of all of those events. And ultimately, if you're honest with yourself, you're going to find out that the seeds of the Civil War begin all the way back in the Declaration of Independence, and then we see it again with the 3/5 Compromise in the Constitution. Because remember, wanted the slaves to be free in the Declaration of Independence, had to be removed to get the Southerners to sign it. The 3/5 Compromise was put in the Constitution because the South wanted to count slaves, which meant the South was going to increase the number of slaves as much as they possibly could to get control in the United States government. This web, if you do this right, can take up an entire wall. It can be huge. But what you do is you get an idea of what really caused the Civil War, and from it you can write this wonderful essay. Now you can research each one of these things as well once you do the web to get more details, and this thing goes on and on and on and on. Anyway, so what we have here is we have a look at the important people and terms of the 1850s, and we have an example of what I call a logic web, which is a very good way to brainstorm the causes of any larger topic. It's hard with a small topic. You can do it with smaller topics for sure. You can do it with wars easily, because wars have multiple ideas. You can do it with big economic issues in a country, but you can't do it with small ones, because small ones make up the big web. Anyway, I'm going to leave that here, and the next segment will be a PowerPoint bringing all this stuff together. That will be 11.3. Remember, the web will not be on YouTube. Excuse me, the web will not be on the website, but the instructions for the web will be, and certainly the example is here. So, until 11.3, which is the PowerPoint, I'm David Busch, and this is Busch History, and I hope to see you there. Have a good day. Bye.